Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program today. This is a classroom talk on Asian revolutionaries and Asian American conservatives. So today we're here with Minh Nguyen and Matthew Shen Goodman, and my name is Teline Trần. I'm with Wendy's Subway. I'll start with just a brief introduction of both of our speakers today, and then we can go into a discussion and a Q&A. So Minh Nguyen is a writer and curator based in New York City and Ho Chi Minh City. She's the curator of Dogma, a collection and gallery in Ho Chi Minh City focused on art and political graphics, and managing editor of eFlex Journal. Her first book, Memorial Park, Revisiting Vietnam, is co-published with Art Metropole and Wendy's Subway. Matthew Shen Goodman is the editor-in-chief of the Baffler. His debut novel, Lording, is forthcoming from Echo. And I'll pass it to Minh to start us off with the talk and preface about her new book.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here today. A lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces. Thank you for coming. And I'm really excited to talk about the book and be in conversation with Matt and Teline. I'm going to describe the book and the background of it, and then Matt will describe his work, and then we'll have conversations attendant to the topic at hand of the title. Thank you also to Wendy, Subway, Rachel, and Teline and the team and Art Metropole for publishing this book, Leon, my editor, and Bryce, my designer, who are in the crowd as well. Okay, so to simply describe the book first, it's a collection of essays that mix travel writing with art criticism and a little autobiography. It's a book that reflects on Vietnam today through my observations and the way that the revolution persists. And by revolution, I mean the 20th century one of the fight for independence from French colonialism and then US imperialism that was led by the communists, and the strange ways that it remains in society the way it's memorialized. It's a book about how a country metabolizes its own history and how it narrativizes itself, which in this case is a story of continuity of the present state being a natural evolution from the past. And I think the conclusions that the essay draws, whether they're about real estate or censorship or art, is that this story is incoherent and doesn't adhere very well, and that people know it and sort of live and operate within or under this facade or false narrative. And these dynamics are part of the post-socialist condition. To tell this story, I found that the autobiographical aspect of writing myself into it was necessary, even though I personally don't love writing about myself, because my life has been also a product of these forces, as all of our lives are. And sometimes that's very relevant for why we seek the things we do or why we desire to study the things we study. Like many among the Vietnamese American diaspora, my family is here because we fled the communist government. My father was drafted for the US side through a complete accident, and an accident that was both banal but radically changed the course of our lives. And because this history is such a trauma point for my family, we never talked about these subjects, and I grew up not knowing very much about Vietnam and why exactly we left, except that we were refugees, which is a very depoliticized idea when you're growing up. You just kind of grow up thinking that life just makes certain people, and, sorry, Leon is smiling at me so hard. It's making me embarrassed. But anyway, but the refugees are a very depoliticized idea that life sort of deals uneven hands and some people are just in the position they are. And one of the first instances of me learning differently, which I write about in the preface, is going to an organizing workshop in Orange County called the Hai Ba Trung School of Organizing, which was organized by Vietnamese leftists whose families had fled communism, but these were activists who wanted to engage with the current issues in the Vietnamese community, like labor rights or displacement or immigration, but also wanted to look to Vietnamese history to try to sort of draw a lineage and a connection to the struggles that happened there and the struggles that were afflicting the community now. And this seems maybe simple, but it was a very provocative thing that they wanted to do, and the workshops were very intense. I feel like it was of a different time too, because it was 2014. I had found this post on Tumblr and had sort of gone through a leap of faith to be with people I've never met before for a week in these very intensive workshops that almost felt like deprogramming school, where we cried, we talked about these things that had confused us for so long in our lives, and for the first time like had different answers. And they were also intense because they were sort of in secret because of the intense backlash from the conservative community. To give an example of the backlash, at the time there was this exhibition at VALA, which is the Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association. And there was 50, it was a huge group show of 50 works, and there was one work in it where it was a portrait of a woman who was wearing a red top with a yellow star, the current flag of the party, and looking at a bust of Ho Chi Minh, and even the ambivalence or even the ambiguity that could be construed as a favorable portrayal of the party ignited all these protests from the veterans who demanded shutdown of the entire show and also left rape threats and murder threats for the organizers of the show. So this is also the context of like Vietnamese diaspora consciousness that is, I think, still very much alive today, especially in places like Orange County. And then from that moment, my perspective had also swung very hard the other way, as in my 20s, I was involved in more leftist and activist organizing, in which Vietnam also holds a very specific symbol and perspective for people of a successful model of anti-colonial, anti-imperial resistance, of third worldism, and still does today. And by the time that I went back to Vietnam as an adult, I took seriously the emblem of Socialist Republic of Vietnam on my visa. I remember being so excited to go to this place to sort of like reconnect with the liberatory roots that I came from. And if you do have that notion, Vietnam will sort of affirm that for you in the way the state messages itself and the way it preserves its legacies in monuments, in museums, in mausoleums, and all the billboards everywhere. So it creates quite a confusing experience. And Memorial Park, the title of the book, refers to commemorative history attractions, where I talk in the book about going with my family to the Guti tunnels, which is the site of where the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, which was this major aggression against U.S. occupation that killed civilians and was ultimately one of the things that swung the war. It's an event that a lot of people compare to October 7th. But it's a very surreal kind of memorialization process, because it's like prideful in these liberatory histories, but it's also kind of an amusement park. So you go, you can like crawl in the tunnels, there's the booby traps, there's the displays of the downed planes as trophies. You can take photos with them. So it's all part of this like nationalist commemoration, and I think it's also a good metaphor for, again, the way that a country memorializes itself and tells its story. And it wasn't intentional that this book came out on the 50th anniversary of reunification, but very fitting, because it's an anniversary that every interest group has a different name for. So in Vietnam itself, it ensued in this multi-day military and police parade where they wanted to commemorate the military victories and the nation's prowess by launching 10,000 drones over the Saigon River. In exile communities, again in California and the like, they will call it the Fall of Saigon or Black April. They will wear all black. There are pushes for it to be recognized on a municipal level of sort of like the day that commemorates the victims of communism. And I always have thought, or like one of the pressing questions of the book, or something I'm continually vexed by that drove the book, is it's really mind-blowing to me that all these different narratives can exist at once, and that the remembrance of Vietnam is something that multiple people can interpret differently, and it all sort of coheres into this memory. There's the story that the party tells, there's a story that the conservative diaspora tells, there's a story that the liberal diaspora tells. How can that be, and why? And I will conclude this introduction by saying that I I don't necessarily think it's a good thing that it can be so openly interpretive. I feel like I write from this place of investment in the history and the revolutionary thought, and that if we are going to remember it and honor it and think about like what lessons we can take from it to apply it to contemporary struggles today, we also have to have a clear idea of the trajectory that it did have, the way it did pan out, and also be able to distill it from all these different interpretations. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Min. I will pass it to Matthew to talk a little bit about his work and research and how it relates to Min, and from there I think it'll flow. You have a lot to talk about and are concerned with many, many similar questions.
Cool. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Matthew Shen Goodman. I'm the editor of a magazine called The Baffler, but I'm also working on this book-length project about Asian American conservatives. I put out a piece in Harper's last November that has to do a lot with this, and a lot of what I'm talking about is from that. So, if you're interested, happy to share that with whoever is curious. So, I sort of came to this topic through a number of tacks, but one is just the interest in how demographics changes the country's politics. Statistics I think about a lot is that in 1980, the US was 80% white. Today, not including what I think the census calls in combination, which is like if you're multiracial like me, it's I think 57%, so that's quite a change, right? And as the country's headed towards majority minority and sort of increasingly an immigrant country, right? There's been a prophecy of sorts for the last few decades, probably best condensed in, there's a book from 2002 by Roy Teixeira and John Judas. It's called The Emerging Democratic Majority. It takes its name from a book from 1969 that's The Emerging Republican Majority that was written by a man named Kevin Phillips, who had been sort of the whiz kid strategist for the Nixon campaign that had won the year before. And the idea essentially of the emerging Democratic majority is that, like this alliance of liberal whites and increasing numbers of voters of color that could be relied on to vote for democratically would ensure sort of the nation would vote blue no matter who for the foreseeable future. And that's been a lot of like demographic understanding of politics on certain swaths of, I'd say, liberals, not so much kind of left-wing. We can talk more about that as well. But a large and sort of under-theorized part of that are Asian Americans when they speak about democratic shifts. There's 22 million of us now. We're predicted to become the largest immigrant group in the country by the mid-century. And from 2020 to 2024, Asian American eligible voters grew in number by 15%, which means that they were the fastest growing sort of such demographic. And so this is an interesting period, right, the last 5 years or so, because over the same period, there's kind of a corresponding explosion in Asian American visibility. I think people have noticed that, suddenly winning Oscars on bestseller lists, et cetera. And what sort of I haven't really written this as such, but like what to me is sort of the Asian American moment, and I'm kind of argue it's somewhat over now, but we can also talk about that, revolved around a very specific thesis, which is sort of after kind of years of voicelessness and invisibility in American public life, and especially in the midst of anti-Asian pandemic hysteria and sort of violent attacks that attended it, it was time for Asian Americans to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. Part of this, right, is that as Asian Americans become more visible, the category gets more and more troubled. It's the largest continent, a lot of those people don't like each other, hard to really bring them all under one umbrella category. A lot of the commentary about the Asian American moment, what sort of defined the Asian American moment for me at least, was the subsumption of that difficulty within the category. So a lot of being Asian American for the last 5 years has been like, I'm going to perform a certain kind of anxiety about what it means to be Asian American. But that anxiety also includes conservatives, right? That's something that's been troubling, I think, because a lot of the commentary also has been written by, for whatever reason, mostly like Gen X Korean Americans with like half white kids has been a lot of the writers about this. It's like, you know, Jay Caspian Kang and Kathy Park Hong and Wes Yang to an extent. But they all sort of have this discomfort generally with like the notion of Asian American conservatives, the presumption broadly being, right, that like the emerging democratic majority thesis, right, that yeah, like Asian Americans were generally liberal in outlook, and if you were conservative, you're sort of being puppeted by evil white whims, or you're the victim of disinformation via WeChat or Kakao Talk or something, you know. So what kind of brings me to my research, or like my writing project, this just seems sort of ridiculous to me on a lot of levels. One of which is that it sort of disempowers Asian Americans from the possibility, like, you know, all other humans, some of them can be conservative, right? But it also was sort of ahistorical and in contradiction to what a lot of Asian Americans know, right? There's many Asian Americans, both long established in this country and also recently immigrated, who are already openly conservative. And so, and you can, I don't know, and generally, if you look at voting patterns, I don't think voting patterns is the only way to look, but if you look at it, one could argue they're getting more conservative. You know, in 2020, the split was 70-30, and that election, the last election, it was 57-40. I don't really know where that 3% went, but that's the latest from Pew. So, yeah, I mean, I guess what's been useful for me then is thinking about like how to define this conservatism. The GOP used to be defined by what they would call like the Gipper's stool, which was a reference to sort of the Reaganite core. So it was sort of a tripartite structure that's foreign interventionists, fiscal conservatives, and then the social right. And Asian American conservatism, at least it's like a tool I've been using to think about it, also has a sort of three-part structure, being sort of educational, like meritocracy obsessives, right? Law and order defenders, and then anti-communists. The education meritocracy stuff is like pretty evident from the affirmative action cases. Also, if you live in New York or a number of other cities, like if you followed the stuff about the specialized high schools and the debates about whether, like, you know, these testing mechanisms that frankly a lot of working class Asians revolve their entire lives around in terms of a means of class mobility and sort of providing material support for the families, but there's also a lot of like upper class Asians who have somewhat, or if not outright racist relationships to the ideas of meritocracy. And then the law and order stuff, especially during the COVID and the pandemic, as there were more and more attacks that were very easily sort of circulated in urban areas, that also, you know, red-pilled a lot of, I think, the Asian American voting public. But I think most pertinent to, and these are all related, you know, but I think most pertinent to this book and what Min's working on is the anti-communist aspect, right? And because a lot of these immigrants have left their countries for political reasons or have been pushed out for political reasons. And it's instructive to look at Orange County, where I think Vala, is that the name of the Vietnamese cultural center where there was the death threats?
So, yeah, in California.
Where there's almost 200,000 Vietnamese people, I believe. It's the largest population of Vietnamese people outside of Vietnam. And it's an interesting history because after the fall of Saigon, 1975, 40% of the refugees end up in Camp Pendleton, which is about 50 miles south of Orange County. And then because Orange County is this sort of Reaganite, again, like stronghold with a ton of mega churches and such, they were able to sponsor a lot of those Vietnamese refugees. And so they really settled places like Westminster, Garden Grove, as a result of like a particular Republican relationship to the idea of, you know, victims of communism and being able to proselytize both in like a kind of muscular Christianity, but also the American way. But, you know, the interesting thing about this area is that it was actually until like 2016 or so, it was starting to kind of turn blue and vote Democratic until sort of there's like a spurt of Asian American conservative candidates who really succeeded by painting their opponents as communist spies often. There's a woman named Michelle Steele, who's a Korean American woman, I forget where in Orange County, but she would run like ads where her Taiwanese American opponent, like Jay Chen, was depicted in like sort of like CCP, like greens, and was referred to as like a comrade of Bernie Sanders and such. And then, you know, if you just go around and you talk to people, they have, especially the older generations, they have a really specific relationship to their country of origin. Like, I spent a good deal of time talking with like sort of Vietnamese cultural associations, and often the thing that I would encounter was that they would complain to me about recent immigrants from Vietnam who had the money to buy property in Orange County, and this being to them obvious sign that these were spies, because they couldn't imagine a Vietnam that was economically prosperous enough now such that someone from there could buy, you know, a nice house in Westminster, or, you know, Laguna Beach is different, but and I think that's where maybe there's like, I found the first essay in the book really interesting, because maybe I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the current state of the Vietnamese economy a little bit, because it's I think it's much different than the notion that a lot of the diaspora, at least this particular diaspora, has of where they came from. Or
should I just answer that?
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was really thrilled to, because I honestly don't focus that much on Asian American political discourse, and I was really curious to see like the threads of that. So this panel sort of arose from my own curiosities and connecting that. But I guess a couple of comments. I think that again, this idea of memorialization, or this idea of like the specter of communism lingering in a lot of people's minds, including in the conservative community, and like what Matt said, is that people are still, they operate from this idea that the country exists in a certain way, that that they, like the party itself tells them, it is a continuation of the original foundations of communism. And I have been thinking a lot about the misunderstanding of this, and I think some of it is structural. I think there is Vietnamese discourse that's in Vietnamese that just doesn't cross over. You know, there's like diaspora discourse that also doesn't cross over, and I think that's something that I found very stark about going back there and realizing that these conversations, or like these reflections that I had about a Vietnam, was like completely created in like an imaginary in the diaspora that people in that like doesn't really concern people in Vietnam at all. Like they have a very different reality of what life is like there, and there is just not enough crossover of these conversations. So we got a new general secretary this year who, like all of the other general secretaries before, also used the sort of like Marxist-Leninist discourse to talk about the growth of the economy. And he has developed lots of different kinds of reforms. He's known as the person who streamlines revolution, or like streamlining revolution is one of his ideas. I wrote down a quote, but so we just had the 80th anniversary of the Viet Minh ousting the French and declaring independence, and that was a very communist group. Of course, if you look at anti-colonial struggle, there's many different forces, and in Vietnam's case, the communists they won because they were the most organized, or they sort of used the structure of communism to overthrow a colonial power. It doesn't necessarily mean that they believed in those ideas, but they still sort of espoused the ideas. But he gave a presidential address, and it says, "My final wish is for our entire party and people to unite and strive to build a peaceful, united, independent, democratic, and prosperous Vietnam, to make a worthy contribution to the cause of the world revolution." And it was commemorated with 16,000 troops from military branches. He's a former head of police. And so there was this, again, huge military parade of this display of missiles and drone systems that were developed domestically, but also purchased from countries like Russia. And they also had delegations there from Russia and China of very much sort of these Cold War delegations, or very much still rooted in this Comintern structure of the world, but and this is all part of like the post-socialist thing now too, is that these world powers have been reconfigured, but are still sort of described in this very 20th century way.
Yeah, I think in your book you describe something called the post-socialist condition, which you sort of analyze through art, these military commemorations. But I would also argue there's like sort of this intense nostalgia and narrative and understanding of the war in diaspora communities. So perhaps you could speak a little bit to how the interpretation of the war itself and Vietnamese history itself informs the actual reality of what the party is doing, but also right-wing conservatives in the US and also leftist circles too, and also like in the disconnect between generations, right? It's like our parents' generation has a really different understanding of what Vietnam is, and sometimes it's sort of static in a history that if you went back and talked about it in that way, it wouldn't make any sense. Yeah, so why don't we spend some time sort of teasing that out.
Yeah. So post-socialism, it's a very academic term, and in academia, it's very loaded. And if you are thinking about doing a dissertation in post-socialism, I would advise against that, because you're gonna get you're gonna get a lot of pushback, because it's like kind of a fraught periodization. Like people are gonna be like, it's still socialist because the party calls itself that, or some people would be like, it was never socialist, so you can't say post-socialist. But luckily I'm not in academia, so I can just sort of use it, because I do think it's a really useful term for describing a set of economic conditions, a set of geopolitical conditions, but mainly what I talk about the book is sort of like observations, or the book is trying to describe the way that these contradictions are written in the urban landscape, or like written in society itself. And so I'm describing something kind of affective. And one of the most useful books that I've read on this is called Urban Horror by Aaron Huang, which is actually about Hong Kong. So a lot of post-socialism theory actually comes from China, which makes sense. But in writing about Hong Kong, she's it's also tied into neoliberalism. So neoliberal post-socialism is this idea that the future has been conceptualized through indeterminate relations with a former system that is neither alive or dead. Rather than describing a new era to come, the post conjoins a suspended future with a reimagined past. So it is just sort of like the stark tension of being in a society where you see all these socialist realist billboards, but they're also next to like the Viet Cong Bank, or they're also next to like the Viet Cong Bank is also a really interesting instance, because that was a public centralized government that then switched over to private after the economic reforms. So it's describing like a mixed economy, but it's also in the book she talks a lot about Hong Kong and like the umbrella movement, and it, you know, like the martial law that was enacted there, and these, she shows these photos of like people being beat up, or like police brutality under the umbrella movement, but also in the back of these skyscrapers that have communist slogans in the back. It's just like that stark contradiction that like instantiates sort of like the idea of communism as a failure and a hypocrisy and cronyism that really prevents anybody living under these systems from sort of like trying to distill the thought, or like the imaginary, or like what, you know, what Marx and Lenin and Ho Chi Minh were trying to describe, and Mao for that matter, we're like trying to describe versus like what it became. So I think that's what I'm mainly describing with post-socialism, and why the term has become, like, been so enduring for me, even though like lots of people are like, this isn't a useful term. And it's also related, I think, to like Asian American, like coming back to that term as a category, even though it's like sort of incoherent. But post-socialism is tied to this Cold War dichotomy that is also like not descriptive of the world we live in anymore. You know, like people are like let's stop talking about the Cold War. We're in like a multipolar world. But it still forces itself on us, and so I feel like we have to like continually address it, even though we don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I often understand the anxiety over post-socialism being the sort of anxiety over what to do with these countries that have, supposedly lost after the end of history in the sort of Fukuyama sense. But it's an interesting moment in the past, as the world's grown more globalized, there's a greater sense within like American academia, but also within these diasporas of what's happening back in the countries of origin, right? Like you're describing the power and sort of the disorientation of returning after 20. What had it been when you made the trip back for the first time? How long had it been since you were last in Vietnam?
20. Yeah.
20 years. And so the current multipolar question is really interesting too, because again, a lot of the Asian American conservatism revolves around images, like I was saying, of the countries of origin, or that often are long gone at this point. All of these economies have had multiple changes over, and I think the Asian American relationship with, I don't. I often find myself like wondering about the Asian American relationship with like ideas of socialism generally. Post-socialism seems to be like a more complicated version once you get a sense of what's happening. But there's also a lot, and within the book too, there's a lot of questions of like nostalgia, right? Nostalgia for places that perhaps you haven't been since you were 7 or so, perhaps that you've never been to. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the questions of nostalgia for a socialism that's maybe not even there anymore in the countries that are being discussed.
Yeah. To comment on, I think that one of the fascinating things to me about going back to Vietnam and spending time there and comparing that to sort of like the anti-communism of the US that I grew up in is the situation sort of results in like cynicism and disenchantment of communist thought and philosophy for like everybody involved. But I think the interesting thing is like in Vietnam, my friends were like grown up forced reading Lenin and Marx, and were sort of like, I don't want that pushed down at me. And I think that's really different, obviously, than the US. But yeah, I think just to address sort of the ways that these ideas are like interpreted and like instantiated by the party itself, that it's like kind of anti-communist in its own right, because it's a very like state interpretation of it.
Yeah, in your book, you kind of talk about your concern with looking at propaganda art and how you are very interested in it, and it's part of your curatorial practice as well. But when you compare it to, friends in Vietnam, it's not really what they're interested in. So I think there's a tension there that's sort of evident in like how the state uses its own narratives for citizens that grew up there, and then how someone like you would come back and interpret it.
Yeah, I have some friends from Vietnam here, and maybe they would like to say something when we go to remarks. But yeah, so the book, and maybe we can talk about like narrative and diaspora, because I have also been very interested in the reviews of like diaspora books that you've written.
Trying to talk about identity.
I love this knowing laughter. You have a reputation.
No.
So I guess to start, when I started writing this book, I thought it was going to be a book of art criticism, because that's mainly the writing that I've done. And I think once I realized that I was sort of using or looking at the ways that artists make work in Vietnam, or sort of like the things they do in a place there where sort of like free expression is more compromised. They're very interesting arenas for like circulating ideas that would be prohibited otherwise. But I realized that I was like writing about them to also write about something else. And then once I realized that, I was like, I'm writing this, like this isn't really like about art anymore, or like I'm not speaking to an art audience in particular. And in fact, I'm speaking to the opposite of an art audience, which is like a very wide audience, or at least trying to. And that's when I sort of had to write about myself, because I was so implicated in the curiosities, and I sort of had to face the fact that I was writing from a diasporic position, even though I think that's kind of a derogatory term. But, I just had to own up to it. I was like, I'm joining diaspora discourse. And
I never said that. Don't put that on me.
I never said you said that.
Know,
I'm saying that
I'm just saying,
myself.
I just want to be clear. I don't think diaspora is derogatory.
But it is. I mean,
But it is.
it is.
It
We
is.
all know.
We
I
can't
got
fight it.
outflanked in terms of being the asshole about shit. No, it's good. It's
Okay,
good.
I didn't say anything about you.
No.
I mean, I think people in this room know. Like there's what my friend calls my mother's dumplings, my mother's dumplings poetry, where
Yeah.
the smell of mine's like my father's imprisonment, but it is diaspora discourse.
Fucking yeah.
But I think I just had to own up to that position because I was like, well, first of all, I think that for VQ, Vietnamese diaspora and like maybe Asian Americans and also maybe half Asians, and I'm only saying that because you've literally written about that in your writing.
I'm being a jerk. I'm sorry.
But
I'm sorry.
I think there's like a trajectory that people deracinated from their communities go through, and one of them might be like the anxiety of belonging or the anxiety of authenticity, of like, locating the thing, locating like the heritage. So I think that drove me initially, but then when I was there, I was like, I am always American, even if I like, get a bunch of like revolutionary leader tattoos and learn the language. I'm like, this is like a separate question that I'm very interested in after writing this book, but I'm like, can you actually de-Americanize yourself? I don't know. The return is like not, like it's not futile, but it's not the perfect answer for like de-Americanizing yourself either. And one of my essays is about that, where I'm like being angsty in Vietnam, but I'm still the person with the American passport who just like comes and goes to be angsty, and is also like writing these stories about my Vietnamese friends in ways that they would never write, like there is sort of a fascination with that narrative that like they just wouldn't have. They would never write like my expat friend. Where was I going? But
Yeah, I think in the book you have some line about how at the end of the day you're still a tourist and you're gonna leave, But I mean, maybe before we get into like the reasons for rejecting Americanism or like trying to deprogram yourself, both of you clearly have feelings about the category Asian American, and perhaps we could talk a little bit about that. There's like, I think a lot of resistance in both of your work about understanding Asian Americanism as just a structure of feeling or an affect, but rather like a subjectivity that is forced and is coercive for different kinds of reasons. Where do you see that like in your work, in your life, in different kinds of political organizing or histories?
The thing that I was going to add about the diaspora position is that once I realized that, I think there is an advantage or just sort of a virtue of being a little distanced, because you can notice things that like people who grew up in this context like wouldn't necessarily find like strange or vexing. And then like something Matt and I talked about too is how diaspora literature is like, it's sort of a negative description, like the structure of feeling is negative, and I think I'm describing something negative as well. And we were talking about this with the books that have come out in the last couple of years that also kind of feel like a bygone time. I think it would be interesting to talk about whether or not people still think those are relevant, but we're talking about like Minor Feelings and The Loneliest Americans, Minor Feelings, which is by Kathy Park Hong, which Matt reviewed. But they're describing like the deracination and the loss, which I totally feel too, but there's also this anxiety about like not belonging in America. And I feel like the negative feeling I have that I try to describe in the preface is like, I was made to belong like too fast, or like I actually belong too much in America. Like I call it like the alchemy of American assimilation, because it does actually feel like an alchemical process where this geopolitical intervention hegemony happens, where they can like bomb the fuck out of your country and then all of a sudden also have a US refugee aid system that you come to, and then all of a sudden you're in elementary school and all of a sudden you have like a perfect American accent and you're writing about the tragedy of the refugees, or like the tragedy of the war, and then you're like paying taxes on a very similar war that is happening 50 years later. And also in 50 years, people in comparison to the other ideological wars that are happening right now that are extremely equivalent to the dehumanization campaign that happened to us when we were depicted as like the anti-democratic communists, we are now held up as like the model minority refugees. Like, I think that's incredibly like disturbing. But that was also like another thing that came up with the commemoration, where all of a sudden it was like 50 years later, people were like extremely happy to celebrate like the Vietnamese struggle in a way that I just felt like it was like so removed from like the history of what it meant and just sort of like the present day applications. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting difference between like bad diaspora feelings that I feel like come from like these mainstream books, where they're always like, I'm entering a room and I'm like not white enough or not American enough, and I'm like, why am I so American? Like,
I mean, I think it is a generational difference that I now, after having written sort of mean reviews of both of those books, I feel somewhat more sympathetic to, because my Chinese mom yelled at me a little bit, but like, you know, and I think this goes, you know, I went back, like just to go back to the statistic I cited, right? 1980, it's like 80% of the United States being white is something that's like kind of hard to imagine, for me at least. I didn't grow up in that situation. Most of my adult life has, you know, been sort of has looked in large part like the Great Replacement, like nightmares of like, you know, white nationalists, and it's been great. It's not been a problem. But I think it does produce an incredibly different relationship to the ideas of like community and solidarity. It's, you know, that back when essentially you were all getting mistaken for being Chinese. Which is really the heart of the heart of the books we're talking about. It's, I'm freaked out about my half-white kid, and I'm tired of being mistaken for being Chinese. Like that's really the two anxieties that I think define a generation, including Chinese, my mom. So she's also freaked out about her half-white kid, and she's tired of being mistaken for Chinese. And
is she Chinese?
She is, but she's tired of it. I need this thesis to keep going.
Another combo.
you can't. No, but I just, you know, I do have some sympathies for older generations, because the world that they thought would be continual is not the world that they've inherited at the moment of peak sort of representation, right? I think I think it's arguable that like 2020 through 2024 was sort of like peak Asian American, and that it's
over now.
It's over. I think it's just going to get more specific, right? Because
Yeah.
once you know enough Asian Americans, like I would never refer to you as my Asian American friend, you know, like it's
because you have so many.
Yeah, but so I know the differences. I feel like, you know, also as like not to get bored you about it, but like as like the distinctions culturally, like being able to make these distinctions between like the different kinds of Asians that you're friends with, it becomes a kind of class marker in other ways, in ways that like for that generation that was unimaginable, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting now. I think we're gonna see more and more things like this, right? We're gonna see, and I haven't heard anyone. I haven't really seen anyone write about Asian American stuff in like a year or two. Like I just like in the same way that for like a good number of years we were seeing a ton of that, which I think is interesting. That's more of like anecdotal like observation. You know, I think also the election broke a lot of this. Like I just like generally, like I think a lot of people who didn't understand that there were conservatives in your community feel somewhat betrayed, but also now know that that's the case, and that's I think across all communities. And so the emerging Democratic majority thesis really, like the back has been broken of that, and I think that really that was again like another presumption of a lot of the writing that's happened, the cultural production, because it's also happening mainly like via like liberal cultural institutions. So the other people you see are mostly like other Asian American liberals. So you have certain, and you're kind of scared about talking about your parents, is a lot of it to me. So.
If our parents' generation was concerned about biracial children, and if they're Chinese, what do you think our generation is more concerned about?
The hate crimes after COVID is one.
I think that was a sort of cross-generational concern.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's like specific to your like community and like material condition in a way that's gotten hyper differentiated by sort of class and immigration history and such. It's your relationship to the current administration is different depending on whether you're an immigrant or not. Different depending on the kinds of communities you're embedded in. There's a lot of Asians in the Trump administration. Like Stephen Chung's like is I don't know if he's still the spokesperson. So yeah, I think, and I would also like again venture that like this is not only an Asian American question. I think there's a lot of like the ways in which we understood racial politics, or it's a period of transition. What was once broad-based concerns are not so much anymore.
I think within like Vietnamese, again, I'm speaking very specifically about like Vietnamese history, and was interested in extending this out, but I feel like Vietnamese diaspora discourse has also gone through waves. Our most famous one is Ocean Vuong, who is really being like tried right now, or who's really being like re-evaluated in a very brutal way. I don't know if you are all paying attention to that, but with his fourth book, people like there's this moment where everyone's like, what have we been reading? Why have we been reading about these dumplings for 10 years? But I do think it's kind of a wave, and like I don't know, I've had so many conversations about this, but like, who can blame someone who like writes something from their hearts in their teens and gets like the kind of acclaim that he gets? Like it's kind of mutual reinforcement, like you're just like, this is what the world needs. If you're gonna win like $600,000 when you're in your 20s for writing these poems.
I mean, he's a millionaire, right?
Probably.
I think he's very wealthy at this, as wealthy as you can be as a poet, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I do feel like it's like a wave and a moment that I would be curious if like people in the audience had thoughts about, but I do feel like I'm part of this wave that comes after of like returnees, or like people who grew up in America or wherever and like come back and write about that experience. And it's a whole group of us. A lot of it is really embarrassing to me. There's a lot of content creators who go back and like they're like, I don't know what to do with my life. I'm 40 in Canada and I don't know what to do with my life. So I'm gonna like go back to the homeland and like document how hard it is. And I'm just like, oh my God, I'm like, these are my people and I'm so embarrassed. But I do think it's a wave. And then like afterwards, maybe, someone will come for us too. Like maybe the
You're
Vietnamese.
coming for yourself right now.
I have to anticipate the cancellation, but like I do think like subsequent waves of people who are in Vietnam who are like writing in English, they're going to be like, who does she think she is? Just like writing about her travels here. I mean, I'm just saying.
I think that's a good relationship. I think you should be writing for the next version of you to really hate you. That's
you
like,
have to have your enemy in mind when you write.
I want the next wave of like fucking Wasian whatever is to just hate me.
The Wasians are gonna come for me?
Yeah,
That's
no, for
crazy.
me, not for you. No, the Ocean Vuong thing is interesting. Maybe this just to go back to another thing is that this is a tendency I'm less sympathetic to in the sort of older Asian American moment, is to invoke various kinds of blackness in order to gain a certain sort of cultural capital. Which, if you look at the Kathy Park Hong book, there's a moment where she's like writing out Richard Pryor routines, in order to like better understand being racialized in America. And then you're like, are you writing the entire routine. We'll see. And the Ocean Vuong thing was really interesting because in the Tom Cruise review in the LRB, and I was surprised no one, like there was some interview, and it gets quoted where like someone was like, Ocean, like people say your style's like too annoying or too crazy, and he was like, listen, like it's not, and I have all this confidence because at my mom's nail salon or whatever, like there were all these black people and they dressed really crazy, and I was like, now I can be confident. There's like, I think that moment where like Asian American writers, creatives, whatever, were like doing that particular rhetorical maneuver is dead, and that's good. I'm glad a white British guy did it, because it's also good to allow yourself to be called out,
Do you remember 88 Rising?
Oh yeah.
Side note.
Every Asian rapper I remember.
Side note.
But anyway.
Something that you wrote in your J. Caspian Kang review too is like, I think the anxiety or like the psychodramas of recognition that Asian Americans have is like very specifically American too. Yeah. Like we're also among Asians who, in my experience, love being Asian. Like you have this description of like some Asians in Seattle or something where they're from China, and like this isn't really like their discourse.
Yeah, there's a lot of Asians here who don't give a fuck about this like anxiety thing.
Yeah. And
they're winning. So
You know what's great too about like the Vietnamese diaspora, not even diaspora, but just like newer generation is like everyone is bilingual now in Vietnam. Not everyone, but many people are bilingual. A lot of like the young people who went through the public school system are in Vietnam, and they're writing. And like I'm really excited to see like the responses to kind of dominant Asian American identity essays from people who grew up in Vietnam. Like, I think like, yeah, going back to Vietnam, I went kind of recently, and meeting people and being able to see that like the art world is moving so rapidly, and like following the economic development of it, and it's almost like too fast. Like I can't even keep up. But yeah, there's a lot to come from like 20-year-olds on Substack or something.
I realized what time it is. Should we open it up?
Yeah, let's do some questions from the audience. Go ahead.
You don't know what 88 Rising is?
The question is, what is 88 Rising? I'm gonna let Matthew explain that.
Wait, who were the original 88? It was like the Rich Brian, but he used to use a different word,
He used to use a terrible name, yeah.
And then, yeah, I think it was just an attempt to like, do a real like for us, by us, for like vaguely urban Asian Americans to rap kind of badly, but I think it was such a niche that it's also like now there's just like avenues to do that outside of this one particular company, so. They sort of won and then they lost because they were prescient in this way. Steve?
Yeah, I would ask Min, and maybe you could expand on it, but could you talk a little bit about the role of the church in these conservative
Oh man.
specifically the Catholic Church vis-a-vis French colonialism in Vietnam, and how that fragments into some of the communities that you've spoken to here in the States. And Matt, I'm less asking about Catholicism, but just generally the role that Christian churches have played in your research into Asian American conservatism.
I think you can answer that better than me.
About the history of the French in Vietnam, not really, but
the role of the church. I don't know.
The churches are, Asian American churches. That's actually something that I've been like trying to figure out more about. They're not the same They don't have the same efficacy as a vector into politics as some of these other ones. But there certainly is, I've talked to some scholars of Asian American religion who have pointed out that there are growing numbers of, especially it's like Chinese evangelical. It's, I think for some of these communities, I got a little bit of like a chicken or the egg problem. It's like a lot of the people I met with in Orange County did attend church, but I think they were already quite anti-communist. Like they were primed by their environment, both in Vietnam but also here in so many ways that it was hard to say. There isn't as strong. I think generally, like again, if you look at like statistics, like Asian Americans less religious though growing than other communities. So like again, that is like the thing that the tripwire that makes you, that radicalizes you or politicizes you, less so than schools. I mean, it's really schools and like and senses of public safety.
Do one more question. Yeah. Yes. I can hear your voice, and I'll repeat the question as well. So that's a great question. Are you looking for ways that you can renew socialism?
Yeah. So the book, it is like a period of time, and I think in the artists that I write about, I am looking at art from the last 10 years. Like I think that's just sort of the art historical method I have, and that is a generational thing. Like we've been talking about, Vietnam is an extremely young country because of the economic expansion. I feel like half of the population is under 30 or 35, and the young people are, of course, like very open to the ideas of socialism and very excited. And in the curatorial work that I do and the educational work that I do about actual like aesthetics of socialism, they're like 19-year-olds. Like my audience is actually all young people, but it's sort of like a strange situation because the criticisms of the government is prohibited. So when they are exercising it, they're sort of called like outside agitators or people who are being infiltrated with anti-revolutionary ideas. So again, it's sort of like the state turning these ideas against them and like calling them anti-revolutionary when they're in fact like trying to like develop revolutionary ideas. And I guess that's all I can say. I think that it is growing, and there are just a lot of difficulties of like trying to build big visible movements there.
Thank you. It's just about 4, so we'll wrap up. Thank you, Min, and thank you, Matthew, for your time.